In the elite circles of Los Angeles, where fortunes change overnight and reputations hinge on whispered rumors, a single act of betrayal threatened to shatter an empire. Ethan Lancaster, a calculating billionaire born into privilege, made the devastating mistake of walking away from his pregnant wife, Camille Bennett Lancaster. At the moment she needed him most, he left, unaware that fate had already set a new course for her life. That course led her into the path of Ryan Calloway, a CEO whose warmth and charisma stood in stark contrast to Ethan's cold ambition. As scandal brewed and loyalties fractured, the world watched with bated breath. Just how far would regret drive the man who once had it all? Ethan had been raised in a life of unshakable wealth, where doormen greeted him by name, private drivers escorted him to prestigious schools, and every wish was met by an army of well-paid staff. His father, Richard Lancaster, built a billion-dollar empire from a modest investment, a story the media loved to romanticize. Ethan, their only son, followed in his father's footsteps, attending elite institutions, Eton in his teenage years, Stanford Business School in his 20s. Power and prestige were the foundation of his identity, and he carried them like armor. It was at an exclusive Hollywood charity gala where he first met Camille. While others dripped in designer labels, she stood apart in an elegant yet understated dress, her only jewelry, a delicate gold bracelet. Unlike the guests who maneuvered for attention, Camille spent the evening in quiet conversations with veteran philanthropists, personally thanking donors rather than chasing cameras. Ethan, a man who measured everything in strategy and profits, found himself drawn to her authenticity in a way he never anticipated. Their romance was a whirlwind. 6 months of late-night dinners, glamorous fundraisers, and impromptu getaways to secluded island resorts. Camille, raised in a quiet suburb of Seattle, brought a sincerity that both intrigued and unsettled Ethan. As an interior designer, she had a talent for transforming forgotten spaces into something extraordinary. A skill that mirrored the way she softened the sharp edges of Ethan's meticulously curated world. After 2 years of marriage, their life appeared perfect. The wedding had been a spectacle of wealth, their names gracing the pages of every high-profile magazine. Lancaster heir marries stunning philanthropist in lavish ceremony. But beneath the polished surface, cracks had already begun to form. And soon, Ethan would realize that leaving Camille was the gravest mistake of his life. At first, Camille had believed their love was unshakable. Finding out she was pregnant should have been the next joyful chapter in their lives, but instead, it marked the beginning of their unraveling. Ethan had recently taken full control of Lancaster Holdings, stepping into the billion-dollar empire his father built. The weight of leadership consumed him, and with each passing day, he became more distant. Long nights at the office stretched into early mornings, board meetings replaced their quiet dinners, and when he was home, his mind was anywhere but with her. She had once admired his sharp intellect and unrelenting ambition, but now Camille saw a different side of her billionaire husband, one that barely acknowledged her presence. He dismissed her attempts to talk about the baby, waved off her suggestions to slow down and find a balance between work and family. When she mentioned prenatal classes, he scoffed, claiming he had far more pressing concerns. She tried to be patient. She told herself this was temporary, that once the dust settled at work, he would return to the man she fell in love with. But deep down, a quiet fear took root. What if this wasn't temporary? What if this was who Ethan had become? Everything came to a breaking point on a warm March evening. 4 months pregnant and battling morning sickness that lasted all day, Camille had gone out of her way to prepare a simple dinner. Nothing elaborate, just something warm, something comforting. Ethan had promised to be home early for once. He had even agreed to discuss the upcoming ultrasound appointment. By 8 p.m., the food sat untouched. By 9:30, she had reheated it twice. At 10:30, the front door finally swung open. Ethan stepped inside, his phone pressed to his ear, his expensive jacket carrying the unmistakable scent of cigars. Camille's stomach twisted. His face was dark with frustration, and before she could say a word, he ended the call abruptly and tossed the phone onto the marble side table with a sharp clatter. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. What happened? Ethan barely glanced at her. Nothing you'd understand, he muttered, pacing across the living room, his agitation palpable. Camille clenched her jaw, exhaustion washing over her. I waited for you. We were supposed to go over the baby's test results together. Ethan raked a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Camille, I don't have time for this right now. I'm trying to keep this company afloat. A cold realization settled in her chest. She wasn't his priority. Not her, not their unborn child. That night, as she lay in bed beside a man who felt more like a stranger, she finally admitted to herself she was a pregnant wife who was facing this journey alone. Camille stared at Ethan, frustration and heartbreak warring inside her. Do you even hear yourself? I've been waiting all night, hoping we could look at the test results together. I texted you. Twice. Ethan exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. Camille, I don't have time for this. Do you know how crucial the Calloway merger is? If I don't close this deal, everything my father built could fall apart. A lump formed in her throat. And what about what we're building? What about our child? His jaw tightened, his gaze flickering with impatience. You don't understand. This is bigger than us. Camille's hands curled into fists at her sides. No, Ethan, nothing is bigger than family. You're choosing business over us, again. A tense silence settled between them, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. When he finally spoke, his voice was edged with exhaustion. If family is your priority, fine. But right now, I can't afford distractions. Maybe you should go stay somewhere else for a while. Her breath caught, disbelief crashing over her. Are you serious? He turned his gaze to the window, avoiding her eyes. I just need some space. I can't keep having these arguments on top of everything else. The words struck like a physical blow. A pregnant wife should never be made to feel unwanted. Yet here she was, pushed aside as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Her throat burned as she forced herself to nod. Fine, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'll leave in the morning. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't try to take back what he said. He simply stared out at the glittering Los Angeles skyline, lost in his world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. The next morning, Camille packed in silence. She folded maternity clothes into a suitcase, tucked away her prenatal vitamins, and placed the ultrasound pictures carefully in her purse. Through it all, Ethan sat in the living room, his coffee in hand, eyes glued to the stock reports on his tablet. She hesitated at the doorway, hoping, praying, he would stop her, that he would look up, see her standing there, and realize he was making a mistake. But he never did. Swallowing the lump in her throat, Camille turned away. The elevator doors closed behind her, sealing the distance between them. As she stepped into the cool morning air, the city buzzed around her, indifferent to the silent heartbreak she carried. She inhaled deeply, determined to hold herself together. Ethan Lancaster had made his choice. Now she would make hers. Camille had no real plan, just a hastily packed suitcase, a hollow ache in her chest, and the sharp reality that she had nowhere to go. The only money she had was what she had earned from her design commissions, a modest amount compared to the fortune her billionaire husband controlled. Going home wasn't an option. Her parents were gone, and she had no siblings to turn to. The only person she could trust was her best friend, Olivia Carter, a marketing executive who lived in a cozy apartment in Santa Monica. When Olivia opened the door, her eyes widened in shock. Camille? What happened? The words barely left her lips before Camille broke down, her body shaking with silent sobs. Olivia pulled her into a tight embrace, rubbing her back as she cried, letting her release all the pain she had bottled up. Between broken breaths, Camille told her everything. The cold indifference in Ethan's voice, the way he dismissed her, the moment he told her to leave. Olivia's face darkened with anger. He kicked you out while you're pregnant? That's unbelievable. You're staying here, no arguments. We'll figure it out. Camille nodded weakly, exhaustion weighing down her body. She ignored the phone buzzing on the coffee table, knowing it was probably Ethan. He wouldn't be calling to beg her to come back. More likely, he would try to frame their separation as a strategic decision, like everything else in his life. Lying in Olivia's guest room, she placed a hand on her belly, whispering words of reassurance to the child growing inside her. She had lost her home, her marriage was unraveling, but she refused to let this break her completely. Then, like fate throwing her a lifeline, an email arrived. Ryan Calloway, CEO of Calloway Ventures, had seen her design portfolio through a mutual connection. He was overseeing a massive renovation of his Malibu estate and was searching for a designer with fresh vision. The offer wasn't just lucrative, it was exactly what she needed: a chance to rebuild, a chance to prove she was more than just Ethan Lancaster's wife. Camille responded immediately, setting up a meeting at his corporate office. She spent the next few days preparing, throwing herself into mood boards and design concepts. Work became her escape, something to fill the emptiness Ethan had left behind. On the morning of the meeting, she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her maternity blazer and steadying her nerves. She was no longer just a pregnant wife cast aside by a man too consumed by power. She was a woman determined to take back control of her life. What she didn't know was that Ryan Calloway would become more than just a client, and Ethan Lancaster was about to realize the cost of taking her for granted. Stepping into the glass-walled headquarters of Calloway Ventures, Camille felt a rush of nerves tighten in her chest. The sleek, modern space overlooked the Pacific Ocean, its panoramic windows framing the waves below. Everything about the place exuded quiet power, the kind that came from old money and ruthless business acumen. She straightened her shoulders and approached the front desk, forcing down the doubt creeping into her mind. The last time she pitched her work, Ethan's name had done most of the talking. This time, she stood on her own merit. The receptionist led her to a conference room where Ryan Calloway was waiting. He stood as she entered, offering a firm handshake. In his late 30s, he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't demand attention, but naturally commanded it. His tailored navy suit hinted at wealth, but the genuine warmth in his expression was what caught her off guard. "Miss Bennett, I appreciate you coming in," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I've heard great things about your design work." Camille sat, carefully placing her portfolio on the polished table. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway. I'm excited about this project." He waved a hand. "Call me Ryan." She launched into her presentation, showcasing mood boards, fabric swatches, and architectural references. Her voice steadied with each sentence, her confidence growing as she described her vision for the estate's interiors. Ryan listened intently, occasionally nodding or jotting down notes. Halfway through, Camille dared a glance at his expression. There was no condescension, no impatient glances at the clock. He was actually listening. By the time she finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in thought. "Your attention to detail is impressive. I need someone who can take charge of this project with minimal oversight." A flush of pride warmed her cheeks. "That's exactly what I intend to do," he smiled. "Good. I'd love to have you on board." Then, after a pause, he added, "I do have one concern. You're expecting? Will that affect the timeline?" Camille's stomach twisted. She had spent years proving herself in a world where power belonged to men like Ethan. The last thing she wanted was for her pregnancy to become a liability. But Ryan's tone wasn't dismissive. It was thoughtful. "I'm due in a few months," she said carefully. "I'm confident I can manage the bulk of the planning and execution before then. We can schedule a break around my due date if needed." Ryan nodded, seemingly satisfied. "That works for me. Let's finalize the contract." As she left the meeting, Camille felt something she hadn't in a long time. A pregnant wife might have been cast aside by her billionaire husband, but she was still a woman capable of standing on her own. She had just taken the first step toward a new beginning. Camille cleared her throat, keeping her posture straight. "I'm due in a few months, but I can handle most of the planning and execution before then. We can schedule a short break around my due date if necessary." Ryan nodded, his expression thoughtful but understanding. "That's entirely reasonable. Let's get the contract finalized and establish a schedule. If you need extra hands, let me know. I want this project done right, and I'm willing to invest in the best resources." Relief flooded through Camille. For the first time since her world had crumbled, she felt valued for her talent rather than defined by her personal life. As they wrapped up the meeting, Ryan walked her to the lobby, casually sharing details about his estate's history. When he made a light-hearted joke about its outdated architecture, Camille found herself laughing, something she hadn't done in weeks. Before parting ways, he handed her a business card. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to call. And take care of yourself. Stress isn't good during pregnancy. His sincerity caught her off guard. After years of being dismissed by Ethan, it was strange to have someone, especially a powerful man, show genuine concern. That kindness gave her courage. Stepping onto the sidewalk, she inhaled deeply, a new sense of purpose stirring within her. She wasn't just a pregnant wife, abandoned by her billionaire husband. She was a woman reclaiming her life. Meanwhile, across Los Angeles, in his penthouse overlooking the city skyline, Ethan was beginning to understand the consequences of his actions. While Camille threw herself into work, he buried himself in high-stakes negotiations, trying to finalize the Calloway merger, the largest expansion in Lancaster Holdings' history. He barely slept, his days and nights blending together in a haze of contracts, lawyer meetings, and boardroom battles. Success was all he had left to focus on, but no matter how many deals he closed, the penthouse felt emptier than ever. Shadows stretched across the cold marble floors where Camille's presence used to bring warmth. He had told himself that this separation was temporary, that once the business stabilized, she would come back. Yet weeks passed, and she didn't. She didn't call. She didn't text. She had cut him off completely, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Lancaster felt a kind of loss that money couldn't fix. He tried to shove the guilt away, immersing himself deeper into work. But it lurked in quiet moments, the scent of her perfume lingering in their bedroom, the sight of an untouched cup of tea she had once left on the counter. And for the first time, the billionaire husband, who once thought he had everything, began to wonder if he had lost the one thing that truly mattered. Ethan sat in his penthouse, scrolling mindlessly through emails when something on the coffee table caught his eye. A business magazine, left there by an associate, lay open to a full-page spread. The headline read, "Ryan Calloway, the visionary CEO reshaping Malibu's skyline." A photo of Ryan accompanied the article, poised, self-assured, leaning casually against a mahogany desk. The piece detailed his latest real estate ventures, including the renovation of his sprawling oceanfront estate. Ethan's stomach tightened. No mention of Camille. But she was there, working closely with this man, his fingers curled around the edge of the magazine as unease crept through him. Ryan Calloway wasn't just wealthy, he was influential, respected. A stark contrast to Ethan's own reputation for ruthless ambition. And worst of all, he wasn't just another client, he was a man Camille saw every day. Ethan shook his head. It didn't matter. She was still his pregnant wife, carrying his child. She would come back. Eventually. Wouldn't she? On impulse, he grabbed his phone and dialed her number. It went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, he left a clipped message. "Camille, we need to talk. Call me back." A day passed. Nothing. He called again. Voicemail. Only this time he realized she had blocked him. A rush of anger and disbelief surged through him. How dare she cut him out? She had no right to erase him from her life. His frustration boiled over, leading him to the one person who might have answers. Olivia Carter. But when he confronted Camille's best friend, she met him with a cold stare. "She's done being your afterthought," Olivia said simply, then closed the door in his face. The rejection stung, not just from Camille, but from those who had once been part of his life. That evening, Ethan's mother, Eleanor Lancaster, arrived at his penthouse, her expression unreadable as she smoothed out a silk scarf. "This situation is spiraling, Ethan," she said, her voice laced with quiet disappointment. "The board is starting to murmur. Your personal matters are becoming a liability." He ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. "I can fix this." Eleanor's gaze was sharp. "Then fix it. Before the media catches wind, offer an apology, take her on a vacation, do something before you make it worse." The idea felt shallow, but Ethan was desperate. If it meant getting Camille back, maybe he could force some kind of reconciliation. What he didn't realize was that Ryan Calloway was about to become far more than just Camille's client. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Lancaster was losing control. Ethan had convinced himself that Camille would eventually return, that she was simply trying to prove a point. But when he heard the news, she wasn't just working for Ryan Calloway but had moved into his estate, something inside him snapped. Camille's new contract required frequent trips to Malibu, overseeing renovations at Ryan's sprawling mansion. At first, she commuted daily, squeezing her drafting table into Olivia's car and spending long hours at the estate selecting fixtures, paint colors, and custom furniture. Ryan checked in on weekends, strolling through the halls as she worked. He was surprisingly hands-off, trusting her expertise, offering only occasional input. That trust felt foreign after years of Ethan second-guessing her every decision. Over time, she found herself talking to Ryan over lunch breaks on the terrace. He shared stories of his early struggles, of pitching his first startup out of a cramped garage, of the failures that shaped him. She, in turn, found herself speaking openly about her modest childhood in Seattle, her whirlwind marriage to Ethan, and the painful loneliness that followed. Ryan never pushed. He listened. And as the weeks passed, Camille realized how much she had needed that. But the long commutes were wearing her down. Her pregnancy made the drive exhausting, and the mansion's endless staircases left her breathless. One afternoon, Ryan noticed her struggling and made a quiet suggestion. "Why not stay in one of the guest suites? It'll save you the drive, and you can focus on the project without running yourself into the ground." Camille hesitated. "I don't want to impose," Ryan chuckled. "Camille, this house is massive. I barely use half the rooms. If anything, I'd feel better knowing you're comfortable, especially with the pregnancy." She resisted at first. She knew what it would look like, how people would talk. But then a near accident on the highway changed everything. A dizzy spell hit her out of nowhere, and she nearly swerved off the road. Shaken, she called her doctor, who immediately advised her to reduce stress and travel. That night, she accepted Ryan's offer, not as an escape, but as a practical decision. When she told Olivia, her friend smirked. "Living with a tall, dark, philanthropic CEO? You do realize this sounds like the setup for a romance novel, right?" Camille rolled her eyes. "This is about my health and the job, nothing else." But even as she said it, she couldn't ignore the strange relief she felt. A pregnant wife shouldn't have to live with a man who made her feel unwanted. Maybe, just maybe, this was where she was supposed to be. Camille moved into Ryan's estate on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Olivia helped her pack maternity clothes, design materials, and a few personal keepsakes. As they drove up the long, winding driveway, a mix of nerves and uncertainty settled in Camille's chest. Ryan greeted her warmly, showing her to the guest suite. It was a bright, airy space with tall windows overlooking the manicured gardens. A private sitting area gave her a place to spread out her work, allowing her to fully immerse herself in the project. That night, as she lay in bed, the quiet hum of the ocean replaced the relentless city noise she had grown accustomed to. For the first time in weeks, she felt a semblance of peace. But guilt gnawed at her. She was still married, and no matter how much she reminded herself that Ethan had made his choice, a small voice in the back of her mind warned her that this decision would come with consequences. By the following morning, her fears were confirmed. Ethan first heard the rumor from a longtime business associate, Richard Pierce, over drinks at an exclusive club. "So your wife's moved in with Calloway?" Richard remarked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Ethan stiffened. "What the hell are you talking about?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "Word is she's living at his Malibu estate. Something about a design project. Maybe more." Ethan's grip tightened around his tumbler. "That's ridiculous." But the words felt hollow. Richard shrugged. "I'm just saying, people are talking." A muscle clenched in Ethan's jaw as rage simmered beneath his skin. How had Camille's living arrangements become gossip before he even knew about them? How had he lost control of his own marriage so completely? He downed the rest of his drink and left without another word, ignoring the curious glances of other club members as he stormed out to his waiting car. Seated in the back of the town car, he pulled out his phone and dialed Camille's number. Voicemail. Again, his heart pounded as he texted Olivia instead. "Where is she?" Minutes later, a curt response appeared. "She's safe. That's all you need to know." The words sent a fresh wave of fury through him. A pregnant wife shouldn't be seeking refuge in another man's home, and yet she had. Ethan had spent years believing he could fix anything, with power, with money, with control. But for the first time, he realized none of those things might be enough to bring Camille back. Ethan stared at his phone, jaw tightening as his latest message failed to send. Blocked. First Camille, now Olivia. He was being completely shut out. Frustration burned through him as he paced his penthouse, the city lights flickering outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had spent years commanding boardrooms, making billion-dollar decisions with a single phone call. Yet here he was, powerless to reach his own wife. The next morning, he turned to the one person who always had a solution. His mother, Eleanor Lancaster, sat in her sunlit parlor, flipping through the Financial Times. She didn't look up as he entered, but the tension in her lips spoke volumes. "So," she said coolly, setting the paper aside, "society is buzzing about your wife's new living arrangements." Ethan exhaled sharply and sank onto the velvet couch. She overreacted. "I told her we needed space. I never told her to move in with Calloway." Eleanor's manicured nails tapped against the side table. "You told your pregnant wife to leave. My God, Ethan. What were you thinking?" "I was under pressure with the Calloway merger." She cut him off with a sharp look. "Business is no excuse to abandon your family. Do you even realize what's at stake? You're not just risking your marriage, you're risking our entire reputation." His mother's words hit harder than he cared to admit. He had been so fixated on corporate expansion, so sure Camille would wait for him, that he never considered she might move on. The thought of another man stepping into his place, into the role of a father, made his stomach churn. That night, sleep evaded him. He considered driving to Malibu, confronting Camille and Ryan face to face, but even he knew that would be a disaster. If she refused to see him, if the press caught wind of the spectacle, it would only make things worse. He needed another approach. By morning, he had a plan. Ethan called his assistant. "Reach out to Calloway Ventures. Tell them I'm interested in exploring strategic partnerships." The assistant hesitated. "You mean with Ryan Calloway?" "Yes." He could practically hear the confusion on the other end of the line, but it didn't matter. If Camille wouldn't talk to him, he'd go through the man she trusted most. A meeting was set within 2 days. Ethan told himself it was just business, but deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't just fighting for a deal. He was fighting for the woman he had taken for granted. 2 days later, Ryan Calloway agreed to meet. Ethan had framed the request as a potential business collaboration, though both men knew there was far more at stake. The meeting was set at an upscale lounge in one of Beverly Hills' most exclusive hotels. Ethan arrived early, his mind racing. He had rehearsed what he would say, practiced every possible response in the mirror that morning. Stay in control. No outbursts. At exactly noon, Ryan walked in. He was composed, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. His tailored navy suit and crisp white shirt were impeccable, but what struck Ethan most was the steady, unreadable expression in his eyes. "Mr. Lancaster," Ryan greeted, extending a hand. "Appreciate the invitation. Your assistant mentioned a possible partnership." Ethan forced a polite smile as he shook Ryan's hand. They sat in plush leather chairs near the window, the city skyline stretching behind them. Ethan spent the first few minutes making small talk, mergers, acquisitions, philanthropy. Ryan listened, nodding occasionally, but there was a slight furrow in his brow, as if he sensed something else coming. Finally, Ethan cut to the real reason he was there. "I understand you've hired Camille, my wife, to design your estate." Ryan's expression didn't change. "Yes, she's been doing incredible work." Ethan tensed. "I also hear she's been staying there." Ryan set his glass down, folding his hands on his knee. "Her living arrangements are her choice. She's had a difficult time." Ethan's voice remained even, but his grip on the glass tightened. "She wouldn't be struggling if she hadn't walked out on me. Surely you understand how it looks, my pregnant wife living in another man's home." Ryan met his gaze unshaken. "I offered her a guest suite because the long commute was wearing her down. She's carrying your child. She deserves comfort and safety." The words hit Ethan like a slap, his jaw clenched, his pulse hammering. "I appreciate that," he said, voice taut. "But you realize what people are saying. There are implications. If by implications you mean speculation that there's more to this situation, I don't feel the need to justify myself," Ryan said smoothly. "Camille is an intelligent woman who makes her own decisions." Ethan had expected resistance, but not this calm, unwavering stance. It infuriated him. He had spent his life controlling narratives, bending situations to his will. But now, his billionaire husband status meant nothing against a man who had nothing to lose. Ryan wasn't backing down. and for the first time, Ethan realized he might actually be losing Camille. Ethan's temper flared. "She's my wife. We're not divorced. I have rights." For the first time, Ryan's calm expression flickered with something sharper. "Then exercise those rights in a way that respects her well-being, not your ego." His voice was measured but firm. "If you actually care, talk to her. Own your mistakes. Don't blame me for giving her a safe place when you were the one who pushed her away." A tense silence settled between them. Ethan clenched his fists but said nothing. Ryan wasn't intimidated, wasn't backing down. Worse, he wasn't posturing like a rival. He was standing up for Camille in a way Ethan never had. Tight-lipped, Ethan rose. "Thank you for your time. This conversation has been enlightening." Ryan stood as well, offering no handshake this time. "If you truly want what's best for her, show her. Actions speak louder than words." Ethan left the lounge, emotions churning. He hated to admit it, but Ryan Calloway had bested him. He was composed, unshaken, everything Ethan prided himself on being. But what disturbed him most was the realization that Ryan's concern for Camille wasn't an act. He genuinely cared. That changed everything. News of the tense exchange traveled fast. Though the meeting had been private, sharp-eyed paparazzo near the hotel lobby had caught a glimpse of them. By the next day, whispers had spread through Los Angeles' elite circles. Was Camille leaving Ethan for Ryan? Would the child be raised with Ryan as a father? No tabloid had run the story, yet. But behind closed doors, speculation thrived. Lancaster Holdings board members subtly voiced concerns about Ethan's unraveling personal life affecting business deals. Even distant relatives of Camille, who had barely spoken to her before, suddenly found reasons to call. Meanwhile, at Ryan's estate, Camille remained blissfully unaware, until Olivia forwarded her an email from a socialite acquaintance. "So, it's true? You're leaving Ethan for Ryan's billions?" Camille stared at the message, hands trembling, her stomach twisted. She had never intended to become a scandal, yet here she was, her name tangled in salacious rumors, her choices dissected by people who barely knew her. Later that afternoon, as she reviewed paint samples in the grand foyer, Ryan approached her. "You look upset," he said gently. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, then handed him the phone. His expression darkened as he read the email. "Looks like the world's decided on a narrative." Camille exhaled shakily. A pregnant wife should be allowed to make her own choices without being turned into a headline. But that wasn't the reality she lived in. And she had no idea how much worse it was about to get. "They think I jumped from one billionaire to another, that I used my pregnancy as leverage." Camille's cheeks burned with humiliation as she read the message again. The scrutiny felt unbearable. Ryan's expression darkened. "That's ridiculous. You have nothing to prove to anyone. You're here for work and your safety. That's all that matters." She tried to smile, but tears welled in her eyes. "I just hate being a spectacle. Eleanor Lancaster must be livid. And Ethan, well, I'm sure he's furious." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Let him be. You deserve peace, Camille. You're not some asset to be passed between powerful men." His words steadied her, and she nodded, determined to focus on the renovation and block out the outside noise. She had an appointment with her doctor the following week. Her priority had to be the baby. Unbeknownst to her, Ethan had already launched a counterattack. Sitting in his office, he met with Marcus Silverstein, a top-tier divorce attorney. "If Camille refuses to come back, I have legal grounds to enforce my paternal rights," Ethan stated. His tone was controlled, but his grip on the desk was white-knuckled. Marcus studied him carefully. "You need to tread carefully. If a judge sees your actions as abandonment, it could weaken your case." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I'm not giving up. That child is mine. I refuse to let Ryan Calloway or anyone else replace me." The lawyer gave a neutral nod, letting Ethan's words settle in the air. That evening, Ethan sat at his desk and typed an email to Camille, carefully choosing each word. He softened his tone, lacing the message with regret. He apologized for his outburst, claimed he missed her, and insisted they talk, privately. He didn't mention lawyers, didn't make demands. The goal was simple: coax her away from Calloway's influence. When Camille read the email, a flood of emotions crashed over her. His words stirred memories of their early love, the passion that once defined them. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. A part of her wanted to believe in his regret, But then she remembered the coldness in his voice when he told her to leave. Remembered the months of loneliness, the way he made her feel like an afterthought. Now, with her baby soon to arrive, she stood at a crossroads. Did she accept Ethan's olive branch and risk falling back into neglect? Or did she stay in Ryan's supportive orbit, risking further scandal? She didn't know the answer yet. But fate was about to force her hand in ways neither Ethan nor Ryan could control. 2 months later, the pregnant wife of a billionaire husband would find herself in the middle of a crisis no one saw coming. Camille's life had settled into an unexpected rhythm. She spent mornings reviewing design plans, attending doctor's appointments, and sharing quiet breakfasts with Ryan in the estate's sunlit dining room. Their conversations drifted from architecture to philanthropy, even literature, topics Ethan had always dismissed as distractions. Ryan was steady, intelligent, and considerate. He never pushed, never pried. It was a stark contrast to the relentless ambition that had once defined her marriage. Ethan, however, remained a shadow in her life. His emails ranged from apologetic to frustrated, some pleading for conversation, others filled with unspoken anger. She read them but rarely responded. She knew his frustration stemmed from fear, not cruelty. But every time she remembered the cold way he had sent her away, her chest tightened. Then everything changed. It was a crisp morning when Camille walked through the estate's rose garden, reviewing final design touches, when a sudden cramp seized her abdomen. She froze, gripping a nearby railing as she tried to breathe through it. The pain faded, only to return minutes later, sharper this time. Panic set in. She was only 34 weeks pregnant, too soon for labor. A nearby gardener, noticing her distress, rushed to get Ryan. Within moments he was by her side, his sharp eyes scanning her pale face. "You're in pain," he said, steady but urgent. "I think something's wrong," she whispered, fear gripping her. Without hesitation, Ryan led her inside, calling her obstetrician. The doctor advised immediate hospitalization. Within half an hour, Ryan had her in his black SUV, driving to the hospital as she clenched her teeth against the growing contractions. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed it: preterm labor. They administered medication to slow the contractions and steroids to help the baby's lungs develop in case an early birth was inevitable. Terror coiled in Camille's chest. She had ignored the signs: stress, exhaustion, the emotional weight of everything. Now, her baby was at risk. Ryan was already making calls, updating Olivia, consulting the doctor. And then, in a move that spoke volumes about his character, he did something unexpected. He called Ethan. "She's in the hospital," Ryan said when Ethan answered. "Preterm labor, you should come." A stunned silence, then a clipped demand for details. Ryan gave him the hospital's address, ignoring the tension between them. Ethan arrived within the hour, disheveled and frantic. He found Ryan outside her room, speaking with a nurse. For once, Ethan didn't posture. His eyes darted toward the closed door. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice tight. Ryan nodded. "They're doing everything they can. She's stable for now." Ethan swallowed hard, then quietly stepped inside. For the first time in months, the billionaire husband was forced to confront what he had nearly lost. Camille lay on the hospital bed, an IV drip in her arm, her face pale with fear. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them over her belly, feeling the rhythmic tightening of contractions. She looked up as the door opened, and for the first time in weeks, her eyes met Ethan's. For a moment, the anger, the heartbreak, the endless tension between them faded. They weren't estranged spouses or bitter rivals. They were two people about to become parents, possibly sooner than expected. She forced a small, exhausted smile. "The baby's heartbeat is strong," she whispered. "They're trying to keep him or her inside a little longer." Ethan stepped closer, his face etched with something she hadn't seen in a long time: genuine concern. He reached for her hand, his grip hesitant but warm. "I'm here," he murmured. "I'm sorry for everything." Camille exhaled shakily, emotions tangling inside her: relief that he came, lingering hurt, and unexpected gratitude for Ryan, who stood quietly in the background. The mess of their past weeks, jealousy, power struggles, resentment, meant nothing at this moment. Only one thing mattered now: the life they had created. Despite medical intervention, Camille's contractions worsened by the following evening. The doctors had no choice but to proceed with an early delivery. As she was wheeled into the delivery suite, tension filled the air. Ethan hovered by her side, his usual confidence stripped away, replaced by sheer panic. Ryan remained in the waiting area, ready to assist if needed. At just 34 weeks, the risks were high. The baby's lungs might not be fully developed. Every second counted. The hours stretched into agony. Camille clung to Ethan's hand, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. Through clenched teeth, she focused on her breathing, while Ethan whispered reassurances, words filled with regret, apologies, and something raw she had never seen before. She needed him in that moment, and despite everything, he rose to the occasion. After hours of excruciating effort, their child entered the world. A thin, fragile cry pierced the air. A baby boy. The medical team immediately whisked him away to the neonatal unit for specialized care. Relief and terror clashed inside Camille as she collapsed against the pillows, her chest rising in heavy gasps. Ethan pressed a trembling kiss to her forehead, his eyes red with unshed tears. "We have a son," he whispered. His voice wavered, full of pride, fear, and a silent prayer that their baby would be strong enough to survive. At that moment, a pregnant wife and her billionaire husband were no longer defined by their past mistakes, only by the fragile new life they had brought into the world. Camille squeezed Ethan's hand, tears streaming down her face. "He's so small, but he cried. That's good, right?" The nurse nodded, offering reassurance. "He's stable, but he'll need monitoring in the NICU." Ethan exhaled shakily, his eyes locked on the fragile infant inside the incubator. The weight of fatherhood hit him all at once, the love, the fear, and the unbearable thought that he had almost lost this moment. Ryan stood at a distance, giving them space. When their eyes met, he simply offered a firm handshake. "I'm relieved both Camille and the baby are safe." For the first time, Ethan felt something he never expected: gratitude toward the man he once despised. Ryan had been there when he wasn't. That truth stung, but he couldn't deny it. In the days that followed, as baby Henry gained strength, the tension between Ethan and Camille softened. They sat quietly beside the incubator, watching their son's tiny chest rise and fall, their past resentments overshadowed by the fragile life they had created. One evening, Ethan broke the silence. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I need you to know, I'm going to do better. For him. For you." Camille didn't respond right away. She was too focused on Henry's progress, celebrating every breath he took unassisted, dreading every minor setback. She wasn't ready to make promises. Ryan visited occasionally, bringing meals and offering to drive Camille back to the estate so she could rest. She was aware of how drastically her life had changed, living under Ryan's roof, yet now standing beside Ethan as their son fought for strength. Ethan, meanwhile, wrestled with guilt. He longed to bring Camille and Henry home to start over, but deep down, he knew the choice wasn't his to make. One night, as Camille slept in her hospital room, Ethan stepped into the corridor and found Ryan there. Their gazes met, thick with unspoken tension. Finally, Ethan extended his hand, his voice steady but heavy with sincerity. "Thank you." Ryan hesitated, then shook his hand. "She and the baby matter more than any rivalry." Ethan swallowed hard. "I want to do right by them, but if she chooses to stay at your place, I won't force her back." Ryan nodded, his voice calm. "Camille is free to choose. I'll support whatever decision she makes." Left unsaid was the looming question. Would Camille return to her billionaire husband, or had she already found a new path forward? Neither man pressed for answers. In that moment, only the life of a premature baby connected them all. The steady beep of monitors and the low hum of hospital machinery faded into the background as Camille cradled her newborn son. His warmth, his soft coos, everything she had endured felt worth it. In that moment, the pain, the heartbreak, the uncertainty, all melted away. Ethan stood close by, silent but visibly emotional. When the nurses disconnected the final wires from Henry's tiny body, tears shone in his eyes. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The relief was overwhelming, but one question remained: where would Camille and Henry go? The morning of their discharge, she packed her hospital bag, her hands shaking slightly as she zipped up the last compartment. Ethan stood near the door, hopeful but hesitant. Then Ryan arrived. "I brought a car seat for Henry," he said, his voice warm but careful. "Figured you might need one." Camille's gaze flicked between the two men, each representing a different path. She pressed a gentle kiss to Henry's downy head, steadying herself. "I appreciate everything you've done, Ryan," she murmured, eyes glistening. Then, turning to Ethan, she softened. "I know you're trying, but I need time to figure out what's best for Henry and for me." Ethan swallowed hard and nodded, emotion flickering across his face. "Wherever you go, I want to be in Henry's life. You both can rely on me, financially, emotionally, any way you need." Ryan, standing slightly to the side, lowered his gaze in quiet understanding. "My door is always open," he said simply. "If you need a safe space, it's yours, but I understand if you prefer privacy." Camille felt an ache in her chest. The thought of returning to the penthouse, once so luxurious, now felt cold. But she also saw the effort Ethan had made. Her voice trembled as she made her decision. "I'll go back to the estate, for now." Relief flashed in Ryan's eyes, while Ethan's shoulders slumped, though he quickly forced a supportive nod. He had lost the right to demands when he sent her away. "I understand," Ethan said quietly. Later that afternoon, Ryan carefully secured Henry's car seat before driving them back to the estate. Ethan lingered outside the hospital watching them leave, his heart heavy but resolute. In the weeks that followed, Ethan visited frequently. Each time, the weight of his mistakes pressed heavier on him. He wanted to be present, to prove himself, but every visit came with the quiet reminder. His pregnant wife had once belonged to him, but now she was learning how to live without him. And he didn't know if she'd ever come back. A new rhythm slowly emerged. Ethan found himself adjusting to fatherhood in ways he never imagined, cradling Henry against his chest, feeling the soft rise and fall of his tiny breaths, fumbling with diapers but refusing to give up until he got it right. Camille watched him carefully, torn between lingering resentment and the tenderness he now displayed. There had been a time when she felt invisible to him, an afterthought in his carefully curated life. But now, as she saw him gently rocking their son to sleep, she wondered if change was truly possible. Ryan kept his respectful distance. The estate was large enough for them to coexist without unnecessary tension. He even offered Ethan a guest suite if he ever needed a place to stay after long visits with Henry. Despite the quiet balance they had found, rumors swirled in high society circles. Whispers about Camille living under the same roof as two men, each with an undeniable stake in her life. But she refused to let gossip dictate her decisions. A pregnant wife might have been scandalous, but a mother's focus was unshakable. Henry was her priority. One morning, as Henry napped in the warmth of the sunlit library, Ethan and Camille strolled through the estate's gardens. After a long silence, Ethan spoke. "I've been going to therapy," he admitted, his voice uncertain, "trying to understand why I became the man I was, why I pushed you away." Camille looked at him, startled. This wasn't the controlled, guarded man she had known for years. There was a rawness in his tone, a willingness to confront his own flaws. "I'm not perfect," he continued, "but I see now how toxic I became. I want to be better. For Henry. For you." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but trust was something built over time, not restored overnight. "I need time," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "I know." From the library window, Ryan watched them with a quiet understanding. He had grown to care for Camille, perhaps more than he was willing to admit. But he also recognized the bond she and Ethan shared, a history filled with love, pain, and now, the fragile connection of parenthood. If she chose to rebuild something with Ethan, Ryan wouldn't stand in her way. Months passed. Henry grew stronger, his laughter filling the estate. Camille completed the final touches on the renovation, closing the chapter on her contract with Ryan. But with the project ending, she faced a new decision. Remain under Ryan's roof, or take the risk of rebuilding a home with her billionaire husband. The choice was no longer just about love. It was about trust, forgiveness, and whether the past could ever truly be left behind. The grand halls of the estate no longer just echoed with Henry's laughter. They reflected the profound changes within each of them. Happiness isn't something given. It is the result of growth, forgiveness, and making the right choices. Camille was no longer the woman trapped between love and heartbreak. She had found her own worth, realizing that a pregnant wife might miss. Ethan had learned that money and power couldn't buy back lost love. A billionaire husband could have. Ryan understood that real love wasn't about possession. It was about stepping back and allowing the person you care about to find their own hap. In the end, the choice was Camille's to make. Where happiness doesn't come from being with someone, it comes from learning to value yourself. This story serves as a reminder that love isn't about control. It's about companionship. Happiness isn't something given to you by others. It's something you build for yourself. If you've ever stood at a crossroads in life, remember this. Your worth isn't defined by how others treat you, but by how you value yourself. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more powerful stories about love, growth, and the journey to finding yourself.